All right, everybody, welcome back to the KSR YouTube channel. We're back from the PRI show, and we got to do a little more work on Mullet today. All right, so we still loaded up in the trailer after the PRI show. If you guys didn't know, old Cleet borrowed my trailer just because it's a little easier to maneuver around than the giant toter. And the PRI show is kind of in downtown Indy, and there's really not a lot of room to maneuver around down there. But yeah, we got some work to do. Get the lockup working, get both of the dump valves working. And what else have we got to do? I want to bleed the brakes again, double check the scaling on the car. Lots of little things to do. Yeah, lots of little things to do. Some of you were asking for weather reports too. So yeah, weather's a little cloudy, kind of chilly. I mean, chilly for us Florida people, it's like 60. Not too terribly bad if we're being honest. But time for me to get to work. See if we can get this thing out of here. All right, well, one thing I definitely have to fix is that crooked sticker. Kind of threw it on at the last minute, going to PRI show, and we didn't get a bubble in it, but it's crooked. And yeah, I changed it so that it would match the car a little better. So the old one was a little dark, so I felt like I needed to fix that. But while you're here on the channel, please go ahead and subscribe. You guys can follow along with what we're doing in the shop. Wrapping up Mullet. We've got a track day with Mullet coming up real soon this week. So that's going to be exciting. Also going to be a few of the other McFarlane racing cars. And we're actually going to go to Gainesville Raceway. Yeah, a little change. Bradenton's busy with an event. Gainesville's right around the corner. So we're going to go do some testing there. Have the shop nearby just in case we have any kind of problems. Run over here. Hopefully not have to do any fixing. But we'll see. But yeah, please subscribe to the channel. Give us a like. Give us a comment. Hit the bell icon so you get notified whenever we release a new video. All right, it's time for me to get to work. All right, so first thing, now that we got the car back from PRI, I know I got to take it apart to get the transmission out to slot the flex plate. But before I do that, I'm actually swapping out the fill cap on the valve cover from where we welded the fitting on at World Cup, because now we don't need that anymore. And then also I'm changing the O-ring on the fuel cell cap, because the alcohol has made that thing swell up, and pretty much every time we were taking the fuel cap off, it was falling off of the cap itself, and then obviously it wasn't doing its job sealing it. So I looked up some O-rings that were compatible with alcohol and ordered those in, installed them on the front and the rear fuel cell, just so for the consistency, and now we won't have to worry about the O-rings being eaten up by the alcohol. So now I'm starting to take out the transmission, like I mentioned a minute ago. Got to take the drive shaft out and start getting this thing ready to do the last fixes on it. Get the drive shaft out here in just a second, and then I've got to go in, actually finish the wiring on the transmission itself, but also do the programming in the ECU that hasn't been done yet. So I rolled over the bucket, oil drain bucket, just in case there was any fluid that leaked out of the tail shaft housing. You know, we like to try and keep the shop clean, but turns out nothing leaked, so that was nice. Taking the belly pan off now so that I can access the flex plate bolts, which right now there's only 3, and we're gonna do all this work right here to add the other 3. You know, the converter came with them on there. The setup is designed to handle a lot of power, and we hope we're gonna be putting a lot of power through the thing. So time now to get the transmission out. You can kind of see all the wiring bundled up on the passenger side of the transmission here. Before we had the car shipped off for PRI, the wiring was mostly in position, at least routed through the firewall, down through some holes in the floor, so that we could finish the wiring once we got it back after PRI and then make everything function. And as you might imagine, in a car with a nice completed heat shrinked wiring harness in the car, adding extra wires to the harness can kind of get a little ugly, at least in my opinion, because now you've got wires that are out of the harness. The one possibility is to go take the entire harness out and add the extra wires, reheat shrink the entire harness, but we didn't really feel like we needed to go through and do all that, nor do we really have the time, as you'll see later in this video. But now the engine is hanging on the front plate and the mid plate, and I need to take the mid plate out, which I'm about to show you the reason why right now. All right, well, we got the motor plate out. Actually, it's the mid plate. Motor plate's on the front of the engine. See how the top of our bolt is clipped off here. So what I'm gonna do is actually bolt it to this new aluminum plate, trace out this hole here, and I'm gonna even TIG weld another piece of metal to fill in that area. And then we'll drill us a new hole there. And then we'll be able to have 6 bolts holding the engine to the transmission, or holding the transmission to the engine. Yeah, that makes more sense that way. And then you can see how on the flex plate, this is pretty close out here to the edge, but then the other bolt pattern is in a little farther. So I'm gonna look and see what our option is. This is a really nice Mazir solid one piece flex plate. Like even the starter ring is all machined as a part of the flex plate itself. So I think what I can do is chuck it in the mill and then just slot. It's about half a hole it's off. So if we just make these like slots instead of straight bolts, we'll use some washers on the front side of it, and that should be plenty safe enough. And then we'll have 6 bolts holding the converter to the flex plate, which for the kind of power we're very soon to be putting through this thing, I think is a good way to be. So on a car like Soccer Mom, we actually only have 3 bolts in the torque converter because there's only 3 lugs on the torque converter to put bolts in. So, you know, it's obviously that's all we need for that. We've never had a problem with them, knock on wood. But let me get to work machining this so then we can put it all back together and I can get on to the wiring things. All right, so now we've moved over to the mill. We're gonna do some milling on this flex plate. And the first thing I'm gonna say about this time lapse is by no means do I consider myself a machinist. Some of you guys that maybe have some machining experience, you might be looking at what I'm doing and kind of wondering what in the world am I doing? Well, for me, I see the tool in front of me and I know what I need to accomplish with that tool, and I think the tool will do it. So I'm just making it work the way I know how to make things work. And obviously I'm doing it with safety in mind. You can see I got my safety glasses on, and I've got the flex plate clamped down really well, and just kind of eyeballed the slot that I needed to make just with some lines that I drew on the flex plate, and then I was just eyeballing the center line of the slot that I needed to do, and I got the job done. So I only showed you one slot on the time lapse there, but I actually slotted all 3 of the flex plate holes. And now we're taking it over to the transmission to see if it's gonna fit. On this spot right here, I get 5 bolts in it, and the 6th one, of course it's always the last one, the 6th one did not quite line up. So I actually took a sandpaper roll and I just opened up the slot on the last one just a tiny amount, and then all 6 of them lined up. So we're all good there. Putting the flex plate back on, I like to use red Loctite on the flex plate. And yes, I always torque the flex plate bolts. Some people just hammer them on with an impact, but I can't say that's really the style we like to do things at KSR. So we torque them. So now we've moved over to the transmission, and you can see this sensor that I'm adding that connects to basically to the transmission case on the back side of it, and on the front side of it, it connects to the shift arm lever. And what that's gonna do is give us a voltage readout for basically the entire sweep of the shift arm lever, and so we can interpret that data and see exactly what gear the transmission is in. So that'll help us with shift timing events, and it will also help me do some programming to apply the trans brake when the transmission is put into reverse, so that the transmission automatically backs up when you put the shifter in reverse. Now we've got the ability to do some trick programming in the ECU. and make it do it automatically instead of having to push the button, back the car up, worry about holding the button while you're turning the steering wheel. Nope, we don't have to do any of that now. All right, well, you probably saw in the time lapse, and I'm sure I talked about it, but we just made a little harness to get the lockup and the line pressure, as well as the gear position indicator, over to this side of the transmission. And we're going to have a large Deutsch connector for the dump and the lockup solenoid on the other side. And then we're going to combine these, combine their 5 volts, combine their grounds, and then the 2 signal wires. So we'll have another 4-pin connector here. And what that should allow us to do is we'll have 2 to unsnap there, 2 to unsnap there, this one plus that one. So the idea is that they can't be plugged in wrong. And you only have to do unplugging from this side of the transmission anyway. I needed to put a plug on the gear indicator, which this is how we're going to do the reverse to where it will automatically apply through the ECU. So now it's, see, we got our, it's basically a 0 to 5 volt 2-inch shock travel sensor from Low Dollar Motorsports, which you don't really have any shocks that are 2 inches travel anyway. But what we'll do is we'll go look at the sensor itself for raw voltage for each gear, and then I'll make some qualifiers in the ECU so that when it's in reverse, it'll apply the trans brake and it'll back up. And we can also do some trick tuning with that sensor, because typically you can be a little more aggressive with, say, your timing in low gear if you're hooked up, and typically you're ramping the boost through low gear. But anyway, it's another option for tuning. And you know, I like options to be able to do as many different things as we can do to help move the car along and make it faster. So, about to stab the transmission in, and then we've got to make our drive shaft loop, stick the drive shaft back in, hook everything back up, and then we'll be down to start, and then we'll be down to finish the wiring that controls all this stuff. And it should be time for a test drive. Late at night test drive again. I know. That's how it goes sometimes. But missed a couple days last week with PRI, so I've been working to try and catch up, or at least I've been working late to try and catch up. But let's get back on this and see if we can get it done. All right, so for our final time lapse of the video, we are putting the transmission back in. And you'll notice I added a red line to the back of the transmission, and what we're doing with that red line is that is the vent on the back of this case. And I talked to Justin Martin, who's sponsored by Motion Raceworks, about using this transmission. He's got one of these, and he suggested a transmission vent catch tank that is above the transmission, and if there's any fluid that gets pushed out of the vent after the run is over and everything cools off, that fluid can go back into the transmission. We're adding a transmission vent tank on the firewall that's above the transmission. The line is constantly going uphill from the transmission up to the vent tank, and then at the end of the run it will drain back in, and anything that it pushes out too much and fills up the vent tank completely will go back to the rear of the car into the big overflow tank that all of the fluids are vented to for the rest of the car. So now this part of the video, you can see Drew's working on doing the drive shaft loop while I connect the transmission wiring harness to the car harness. So that takes a little bit of, you know, finishing up. A lot of these features that this transmission has, there's now double of for the Turbo 400 compared to the Power Glide. So before, with the Power Glide, we had the overdrive unit on the back, which we are now using that wiring for the soft lockup that has to be applied before the full lockup is applied. Yeah, I know it's a little confusing with all these lockups and dump valves and all this crazy stuff, but the Power Glide had one dump valve to dump the converter charge pressure. Well, the Turbo 400 has two, so that you have two stages of torque converter pressure manipulation, which will help us make the transmission work better for the car. We can play around with the stall of the torque converter with the dump valves, and these are a lot better engineered setup than what we were using on the Powerglide setup, which basically just dumped all of the pressure all at once. So this setup that's on the M&M Transmissions Turbo 400, they're actually metered dumps, so that you end up with two different stages of converter charge pressure manipulation. Kind of a lot to say when you think about it. Got to finish up all that wiring, hooking up the transmission cooler lines back to the transmission. Another thing we've got to be mindful of is keeping the harnesses routed in a way that they're not going to be dragging the ground, but they're also not going to rub on anything or be strapped up right next to the transmission cooler lines, because those lines do get pretty hot and we don't want to melt any of the wiring or damage the wiring. So these lines are held over, so the harness is held over to the chassis of the car, and by doing that it lets us keep the wiring harness separate from the transmission cooler lines, and where they have to cross each other, we leave an air gap around those with our routing. All right, so you might can see I'm using a special set of crimpers here that we got from wirecare.com for our Deutsch connectors. You'll see more of that in the future, and yeah, I am heat shrinking the little sub harness here just to make it all nice and tidy. So that's gonna wrap up this time lapse. Enjoy the rest of the video. All right, well, as cars have a tendency to do, they take longer than you think they're going to get ready. So our list grew by a good amount while we were working on it. See, we added another half page to the list there. And the last thing that was on the list for this go around before we take it to the track is a test drive to make sure that everything works. So I've kind of done some testing. I reprogrammed a lot of the extra features with to work off a TPS, so that I could just roll the throttle and hear the different electronics of the transmission functioning, or at least the relays that control them turning on and off. But there's nothing like actually proving it for, you know, proof of concept and actually taking it for a test drive. So we're gonna go for a quick test drive. Let's see if this thing works. So another thing that should also be working is when I put it into reverse on the shifter, it should now back the car up. Guess we'll see if my little sensor trick works. Go on a quick test drive. Here we go. On the shifter, and then you'll hear a third RPM drop, assuming the lockup works. Need to find me a little spot I can hit 50 miles an hour. And then we'll do a test. Second Still getting used to pulling back for park. But success on the test drive. So that's pretty exciting. You may wonder why I backed in, because I'm putting the car in the trailer to go to the racetrack. It's gonna happen later today, but you guys won't get to see that till tomorrow or the day after. So appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. We'll see you guys next time.